Okay, so hello. If we haven't met before, and I know one or two of you have, because I recognise some names, but for those who haven't, my name is Julie Cullen, and I'm a career coach who specialises in helping people, particularly women, build their confidence, and in particular to speak more confidently, which is always a big struggle for many people. And whether that's speaking up in meetings, speaking on a stage, speaking one-to-one to different individuals, different types of people. There's lots of different reasons why we struggle to communicate effectively or the way we would like to when we speak up. And so I do a lot of training and coaching trying to help you improve your ability to speak up in the way you would like. And today, on that theme, I'm going to teach you the 6 steps that you can take that will help you when you need to have a difficult conversation. So it's a conversation that you might struggle with, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. And so what I want you to do in the beginning is I want you to think about why you struggle with difficult conversations. Okay, so start thinking about what are those conversations that you're uncomfortable having and why? Perhaps it's the challenge of not knowing what to say. You're not sure how to even start the conversation. What are the right words? What's the right approach? How do you say what you want to say without offending the other person? Or maybe for you, you don't think it's your responsibility to speak up. Maybe there's a situation that you think, maybe whether it's at work or a family situation, where you think the other person should be dealing with it or someone should be dealing with it. You just don't think it should be you. You're not comfortable taking the lead and you're waiting for somebody else to do that. Okay. Some other examples might be, in fact, one of the most common is the need to be liked. You worry about speaking up because you want to keep the peace. You don't want to upset anyone and you don't want them to become upset at you. So you have this drive to avoid conflict. And so you choose not to say anything, hoping it will all just go away, resolve itself. I wonder if any of those resonate with you. Let me know in the comments if what it is that you feel causes you to avoid a difficult conversation or struggle to have that difficult conversation. And so the thing is, avoiding the conversation actually creates more discomfort every time you see the other person. So by not having the conversation, you can become more uncomfortable than actually just having it. So I want you to think about that. By maintaining that silence, you can create pent-up frustration that only makes you feel worse. Okay, so to get the most from today's lesson, I want you to think about a very specific conversation that you would like to have, but that you've been avoiding. Or maybe even you've tried to have and it didn't go so well, right? And it can be at work or home, it doesn't really matter. But it needs to be a conversation that you know would help you feel better if you had the confidence to speak up. Okay, and I've seen some comments already. So Teresa, you don't struggle. You think the problem is that you tend to be aggressive. Okay, so you feel that you're aggressive when you have the conversation. So one of the things to do when you're going through the 6 steps in this lesson today is think about how you could take a different approach based on the framework that I'm going to give to you. And it'd be interesting to hear at the end if you think that's going to be helpful. And in fact, actually, some of you might, if you don't already have a piece of paper handy, you might want to have one available to you so you can jot down some notes as we go through it. So if you don't already have one, maybe you want to go grab one quickly now. And at the top of that bit of paper, write down who you want to have the conversation and what it's about. Okay, so think about it. Is it a workplace conversation? So maybe you don't like the way one of your colleagues speaks to you or speaks to another member of the team and you'd like to raise it with them. Do you want to have a conversation with your boss about your pay or the performance evaluation that you think was unfair and you don't know how to approach it? Maybe you feel taken advantage of in some way and want to raise it with the person direct, or maybe raise it with your boss. Maybe you're the boss and you need to have a difficult conversation with one of your team. So think about the different conversation you would like to have a better, more constructive conversation with. And maybe the conversations at home. We have difficult conversations through all walks of life. You know, do you get really frustrated with your partner about something you would like them to do or not to do? But each time you talk about it, you just end up in a huge argument that gets more and more heated the longer it goes on. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. Maybe it's a conversation with a sibling or parent that just feels too awkward. You don't want to upset them, so you stay silent, even though you find their words or their actions very upsetting. Maybe, as Teresa says, maybe it's when you have the conversation, you don't like the way it goes. You feel like you could be more effective at having the conversation. Okay, so think about it. Are you avoiding it, or are you not liking the way it goes and want to get a different result, to take a different approach? Okay. So one of the things I want you to think about when you're doing this, so you're jotting down what the conversation is and writing down what's stopping you from having the conversation or what's going wrong when you have the conversation. So I mentioned a few before, maybe it's the worry, not knowing what to say or how to start. Maybe you think it's somebody else's responsibility, but now's the time to take ownership. You're here, you could take responsibility. And if it's something that's causing pain for you, then you should take responsibility in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you're just trying to keep the peace. You're just avoiding it altogether. Whatever your reason for feeling like this is a difficult conversation, I want to know what you believe about the conversation that leads you to think about that, or think like that. So Teresa, you've mentioned you come across as rude if you're being straightforward, and it can end up with an unintended result. That's interesting. So I want you to think about that when we're going through the exercise and the 6 steps. Are you being rude? Is that your perception? Is that your belief? Is it the other person's belief? Okay, so think about that. And it's worth spending a bit of time. If it doesn't pop into your mind straight away, maybe go away and think about it later on. Because what you believe is a very important and powerful influencer on how you behave in any situation. Okay, if you believe the conversation will end in an argument or will upset someone, or that you'll make a fool of yourself, then that will influence how you either have the conversation or how you choose not to have the conversation. Okay, so all of our behaviors are influenced by our beliefs. And so while I'm about to give you a 6-step framework to enable you to have a conversation, a difficult conversation, if you don't believe in yourself and your ability to apply the technique, you could find yourself stuck in the same loop. It's why in my speaking with confidence training, I combine both communication skills and confidence skills, because you kind of need both. You need the belief and the confidence in yourself to be able to use the communication skills you learn. And if you want to be able to have the difficult conversation, you need to believe that you can. So what I want you to do on your piece of paper is write down what you currently believe. Why do you fear or avoid having the conversation? Or why do you fear? What do you believe causes the conversation to go wrong? And some people are already sharing that already, so thank you so much for that. The other person becoming defensive, yeah, and reacting to what you say. This is a great framework for you. So Vicky, yeah, pay attention when we're going through the framework and use that example that you've got in your head when you're doing the steps. Teresa, usually because I raise my voice when I don't get what I want. Okay, wow, that's a powerful one. But yeah, there's a whole kind of different tools and techniques within the course, all about the different ways in which we communicate. So again, when you're going through the steps, think about why you raise your voice. Why do you feel the need to raise your voice? And this framework is very specifically about how to try and stay calm in the situation. So I really hope this helps with you. Being calm and composed during the conversation is difficult. It can be. That's what this framework's all about. Okay, applying the framework to get yourself thinking about how you're going to stay calm. Because usually the reason we don't stay calm is we haven't prepared enough. We haven't planned enough for what we're going to do when things maybe start to upset us in the conversation. Rachel, I tried to be best to be calm, but I found out that some particular people or person just likes to be dominating. Yes. And it will end up in an argument, which you try to avoid in the first place. Yeah. So one of the things I want you to think about, Rachel, when we're going through the framework is maybe you need to have a conversation with that individual, that particular person that is dominating. Maybe that's the conversation you need to have with them. So think about that when we go through the 6 steps and how that might go, how you might have that conversation with that person. Teresa, I think sometimes just having the conversation is perceived as aggressive, especially in the UK culture where people avoid conversation at all costs. Yeah, and that's the powerful thing here is the avoidance of the conversation is what can create the discomfort. So having the confidence to have the conversation is what I want you to walk away with today. Not just the framework, but the confidence. And how not to have it aggressively. Teresa, my conversation often ends with the other person getting what they want from me. Okay, now this framework is designed to help you frame the conversation. You might not get what you want, but the person is clear on what your expectation is. And I'll also share an example with you of what happens when the conversation doesn't go the way you wanted it to, and how to start thinking about what you would do in that situation. Okay, so lots of great input there. Thank you so much for being so engaging. I love it. So when you're thinking about the beliefs in that situation, you want to have the conversation with this person, or you've had the conversation with a person that went wrong. Whatever it is for you, whatever you've written down, there's 3 things that I want you to think about, the beliefs in that situation. What did you believe, or do you believe about yourself in that situation? And a few of you mentioned a couple already. What do you believe about the other person? We've seen that mentioned. And what do you believe about the actual situation? Do you believe going into the conversation that it's going to end up in a row? Just what is your belief? So there's 3 things that you will believe in that situation. There's a belief about yourself, a belief about the other person, and a belief about the situation. So to give you a wee example of what that might look like, I'll share a personal story. I was working as part of a team, and there was a restructure, and we had a couple of new people started, and I was looking forward to it. I knew these people. I thought I'd got on quite well. We'd all work well as a team. And one of the new colleagues was going to take on my role and responsibilities. So I was going to move on to do something else as part of the team. They were going to take on my previous role. And the other person was taking a leadership role within the team. And I started working with this new colleague to hand over my roles and responsibilities. However, it was becoming increasingly difficult. Now, this person would cherry pick what they wanted to do and wouldn't make themselves available, and would simply just not take ownership of certain tasks, no matter what I did. And it was really starting to become frustrating. It was an issue, and no matter what I said or did, the situation with this colleague just didn't improve. I tried having conversations with them. They would agree to a set of actions and then just not do them. And I just didn't know what to do. In that situation, I didn't know what to do. I certainly had never learned this framework before that, unfortunately. So I approached the lead in the team to ask for their help to resolve the situation. I didn't plan properly for what I wanted to say. I didn't have this framework available to me at the time. I just went in and the conversation didn't go very well. And this individual, the lead in the team, was not very supportive. It was kind of like, you two just go and sort it then. But I felt like I was then just left alone. I wasn't sure what to do next. I was trying to have conversations and nothing was happening. And then what happened, excuse me, over a period of time was that the relationship between the 3 of us just slowly disintegrated. We never really properly gelled as a team. And it was such a relief for me. The problem was resolved because of another restructure. And in actual fact, the 2 of them were moved off and I didn't need to deal with them anymore. But Despite the fact that the problem went away, it left a very sour taste in my mouth because I'm someone who likes to fix things. I like to resolve problems, and I was very frustrated at not being able to do so in this circumstance. And when I look back, I can see how the framework I'm going to show you would have helped, and that's why I want to share it. But before we get to the framework, I did take a look at my beliefs in that situation. And what I could see was the three things. The belief about myself. I started to believe that I wasn't capable of fixing the situation. The belief about the other people was that they're only interested in themselves. They weren't interested in making this work. And then the belief about the situation. I believed that I was trapped in a non-supportive group. So with all those beliefs floating about in my head, it was no wonder I was struggling to have the conversation. No, it was making it more difficult because I already had that in my head before I even approached the conversation. It was never going to go well. So do that same exercise for yourself and be really honest to what you believe about yourself, the other person, the situation. By doing that, you can be better prepared to have the conversation. It's not just about the framework, as I say, it's about your confidence and your ability, and your beliefs will influence that. There's a mindset aspect to everything I teach, mindset and techniques. So this is the mindset piece. You need to get yourself in the right frame of mind. Okay, so let's move on to the actual framework. You know the conversation that you want to have, or that you've had that didn't go well. You understand your beliefs in that situation. Now, let's look at the framework itself so you can have a better conversation. So the very first step in the framework, 6 steps, first step is, why do you want to have the conversation? You need to understand why you want to have the conversation. So I want you to think about that, and I want you to write it down. Drop it in the comments to share if you want. What are you hoping to achieve by having the conversation? And I'm going to steal a very simple example from one of my clients who I was working with last year, who was becoming increasingly frustrated at his partner. So he worked, she stayed at home, looked after their young preschool toddler. And the way he described the situation was that some nights, after a long 2-hour commute home on the train, he would walk into the kitchen, see the lunch dishes lying on the counter surface, and that was a trigger for him. He felt there was no justification for the dishes not to have been lifted and put into the dishwasher as soon as lunch was over. He would start banging the dishes into the dishwasher as he very loudly made sure that his wife knew he was frustrated at her inability to put the dishes into the dishwasher when she finished lunch. Now, I use this scenario because I'm sure there's a few of us can relate to this type of situation, particularly at home and maybe even the workplace. I know I've had loads of similar clashes with my partner about different things, that behaviors that trigger your frustration, your anger. And so during one of the coaching sessions we had together, after he had completed his training on communication styles, which is one of the things I teach, he realized that what he was doing was very passive-aggressive behavior, and he wanted to change it. He realized only the previous week, in our previous coaching session, he had been complaining about the passive-aggressive behavior of his boss, and he now realized that he was doing the same to his wife. So he wanted to resolve it. He wanted a better outcome. He wanted to have a better conversation. But he was struggling to know how to begin. And usually every time we tried to have the conversation, it would just blow up into a big, huge row. It never got anywhere. And he would end up putting the dishes in the dishwasher. So what about you? Do you know how to begin the conversation? And do you want to know when to have the conversation? So it was not a good idea for my client to have the conversation in his angry state, which is what he was doing. So I advised he picked a more appropriate time for a calm, uninterrupted conversation. So for those of you that mentioned the emotional state of having the conversation, would there have been a better time to have it? And one of the things, actually, I always recommend to anybody, if you're going to have a conversation like this, what might become a difficult conversation, is to have it face to face. If you can't meet in person, at least consider a video call. You don't want to have this conversation when you can't see each other. It makes it even more difficult. You want to see the non-verbal reaction as well as hear the spoken words. It's why I've got a whole section in my training on non-verbal communication, because it's very important to get a good conversation. So step one, I want you to write down why you want to have the conversation and when would be the best time for you. And Teresa's saying, I guess the point of having difficult conversations is to communicate situations of struggle or discomfort. And often it is, exactly. So it's how do you share that discomfort? How do you share that without becoming emotional? And that's what this framework's all about. Okay, so you've got step one. You've got your example. You've got your why you want to do it. And you've decided when you should do it. Step two, usually a difficult conversation is based on a behavior of the other person, something they've done, something they've said, something you would like them to do. So it's always good if you have a previous example that you can share with them. Now, it has to be a very specific example. This is what you're going to anchor the conversation to. So it's a time, it's a place, it's specific facts. Don't generalize. Right, just one very simple example. This is not the time to pile on the "you always" type conversation, right? You know what I'm talking about. And it was mentioned earlier on about somebody having a problem with a particular individual and the behavior of that particular individual. So if you were going to have a conversation with them, rather than say, every time I speak up in a meeting, you talk over the top of me or something like that, don't generalize. Say, when we were in the team meeting yesterday, I was speaking and you spoke over the top of me. It's a very specific example. And you're going to describe it very factually, no emotion. Okay, so in my client's example, it would not be a good idea to start with, every time I come home, you never put the dishes away, yada, 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 yada. You know, that kind of conversation. You want to pick one very specific example and stick only to that example. Write it down. Think about, what day did it happen on? What triggered the situation? What happened? What was the outcome? Okay, so in my client's example, that might be, when I came home from work last night, I walked into the kitchen and I saw the dishes lying on the countertop. Okay, so at this point in the conversation, all you've done is laid out all the facts that you've planned for, because you've written them down. You're writing them down now, aren't you? What are the facts of one particular situation that you want to speak about? That's step two. Step three is then you want to state how it made you feel. Don't assume the other person knows the impact they're having on you by their behavior. They might be totally unaware of how it's making you feel. It's your job to clearly explain how this incident made you feel. This is when you start to share your emotional response at the time of the incident. But you don't want to go back to that emotional state during the conversation. Okay, so you want to stay calm. We talked about that earlier. You want to stay calm and factually state how it made you feel in that moment. So in my client's case, that might look like, I was so exhausted after a hard day at work. I felt like I just wanted to come home and relax. I felt I couldn't relax because the dirty dishes were lying about. It made me feel irritated. Okay, I've shared exactly what was happening to me at the time without sharing the emotion of it. Okay, you share in a very calm, non-emotional way how it made you feel at the time. So you might say, at yesterday's department meeting, I was speaking, you interrupted me. It made me feel like my voice didn't matter. It made me feel like you weren't interested in what I had to say. I felt upset. You can say that without becoming emotional. So be prepared for what you want to say in that moment. Then step 4. Now's your time to shut up and listen. A conversation has to be both ways. Both parties need the opportunity to be heard and listened to. This isn't just about what you want. It's not just about you. It maybe feels that way, but it can't be that way. They have thoughts and feelings about the situation as well. And it's important that they're given the opportunity to share them with you. So listen with your mouth shut. Don't interrupt. Don't make noises. Don't communicate with negative body language. Listen with a view to truly understand their perspective. Don't go in with your own agenda. This is what I'm going to say, and this is the result I want, and that's it. You have to be willing to know what the other person is thinking or feeling in this situation. So a good communicator listens with the intention of understanding the other person, not with the intention of responding with their own thoughts and opinions. That is so important. Listen with the intention of understanding, not with the intention of responding. So many people do this. They're listening, but they're not really listening because they're waiting to speak as soon as the person takes a breath. Okay, that's why I have a whole section in my training on non-verbal communication. Listening is one very, very important aspect of that. Okay. Rachel's asking, what if the behaviour was deliberate and the person fully knows that you don't like that behaviour? Okay, so the conversation I suggest, Rachel, that you then need to have is the conversation with the person about their behaviour, letting them know how that makes you feel, and then finding out from them why they're deliberately doing it. Okay, and I'm going to share a story later on. You might not get the answer back that you want. You might be surprised by the answer you get back. You might be angry at this answer you get back. But remember, a conversation doesn't have to start and stop with just one meeting. The conversation can continue over a series of days, a series of months. But the first conversation, is important that you put across what the situation was, how it made you feel. Let them share what they think about the situation, and then we'll go on to the next 2 steps. And then we'll think about at the end what that might mean for you in terms of any kind of follow-on conversation that you might need to have. If their behaviour was intentional and deliberate in one forum, then the conversation you want to have with them is about how that made you feel and trying to understand why they behaved in that way. Does that make sense? I hope so. Let me know if that made sense for you, Rachel. So moving on to step 5. So you've outlined the situation, you've outlined how it made you feel, you've listened to what they've got to say. Okay, now you're going to validate what you heard. So to demonstrate that you've properly listened to the other person, because they might not have properly listened to you either, and you don't want to do the same back. You want to be the better communicator. Okay, so you want to make sure that you've properly listened by reflecting back on what they've said. So in this example of my client, and what happens in many households is that people don't really listen to the other person's perspective. As soon as the other person tries to explain or justify their behaviour, we jump right in, we shoot down their argument, and we push our agenda. So in that situation, in the home-based one, it could be he comes home, the dishes are there, he says to his wife, why didn't you put the dishes away? She tries to explain why she didn't put the dishes away, and all he does is, you should do it, you must make time for it, why can't you make time for it? It's such an easy thing to do, you just push back. That's a kind of typical response. If you think about a home situation, it's much easier because you know the crescendo that happens when you and your partner start arguing about a simple thing, and it just builds and builds because neither of you are listening to each other. You're just pushing your own agenda. So the 5th step, it's important to validate what you've heard. Okay, so what happened in this situation is my client's wife was having to deal with a very hyperactive toddler, and was finding it difficult to get through the day. So the dishes were often moved to the counter with the intention of putting them in the dishwasher once the toddler was settled. But more often than not, it was difficult to find the time. Now, because my client had learned through her training to listen properly, he did. And he knew what a challenge their toddler was. They were having some difficulties. They were actually seeking help because they were worried about this hyperactive toddler that they had, and they were struggling to deal with it. So he recognized and could empathize with his wife's situation and realized that his passive aggressive behavior was just aggravating the situation. And in actual fact, it wasn't the dishes on the table or the counter surface that was his problem. He was reacting out of a frustration that he was experiencing at work, right? And I'm pretty sure a few of us can relate to that. We bring our pent up anger from work home, and then it blows up. So now that he's listened to his wife, he shared his thoughts, his feelings, his emotions. He's listened to his wife's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. He's validated that back, and she now knows that he understands her position. Okay, and then in the final step, this is your opportunity to round off the conversation, and this is what I was talking about earlier on. So you've stated your position, the other person stated their position. It might not be what you wanted to hear, and they might still be aggressive, but you've listened to them and you've reflected back on what they've said to you. Now you go back to your position. You restate why you brought it up, why you're having a conversation. You acknowledge what the other person has shared with you, and then you state again, very calmly, non-emotionally, what you would like to see change, why you feel that behavior is inappropriate. Okay, so in my client example, he actually decided that he wanted to change because he realized his reaction wasn't helpful in that situation. So the outcome wasn't what he expected. The outcome wasn't that he suddenly was coming home every day to the dishes put in the dishwasher. Right? He was the one that decided in that situation that he wanted to change his behavior, not the other way around. Okay, in a different situation, maybe he would have had agreement with his partner that the dishes would be in the dishwasher, and maybe once the toddler calms down, they'll get to that place. But one of the reasons I raised that example, and I mentioned earlier, is I want you to think about what you'll do if the conversation doesn't go the way you would like it to. Because if you hold on to the desired outcome too tightly and expect the grand gesture of an apology or the grand gesture of somebody agreeing that they're never going to behave like that again, and that doesn't happen, that can become very difficult. You can feel deflated, you can feel defeated, you maybe even end up in an argument, and you don't want to get to that place. So you want to think about and be prepared for it not going your way. Because this conversation is not just about you telling the other person what you want, then expecting them to agree. You need to be prepared for that. And I remember a story that was shared by someone who had decided to have one of the most difficult conversations of his life. This wasn't my client, this is someone I heard about. And this person grew up in Northern Ireland back in the 1970s and 80s, for those of you who are old enough to remember. That was when there was a lot of troubles. If you're not old enough to remember, the streets were like a battlefield, right? There was constant friction between the Protestant and Catholic communities. The British Army was involved. They were on the streets, roaming the streets with weapons, ready to, it was like they were on a battlefield. And he was only a young boy. I think he was like maybe in his early teens. And he found himself caught up in a situation. He wasn't part of the trouble at the time, but he found himself in a situation where there was trouble, and he ended up being shot. He was shot right in the middle of his forehead by a rubber bullet, and the incident blinded him for life. A really horrific experience. And it would be understandable if he harbored real anger at the soldier who fired the bullet, but he actually didn't. And as he grew as an adult, he wanted to meet the soldier who shot and blinded him. He felt it was a necessary part of the healing he needed to do. Now, he admitted that there was some kind of expectation on his part that all these decades on, the soldier, who was now retired, would likely feel some guilt for blinding this young boy, who would likely show some kind of remorse during that conversation, as many of us might expect. But that didn't happen. When they met, the soldier, who, as I say, was now an old retired man, had said that he felt justified in firing the bullet as he was responding to a situation on the ground. The boy had not been his intended target. The boy had run into the shot, but the shot was intended for a disturbance, a crowd that the boy had run in front of. Now, that was not the response the man had been expecting. And in fact, from the soldier's perspective, not the easiest response to give either. It's easy to say sorry, but he didn't. And that was not the response the man was expecting. So he chose not to be angered by this. He deliberately chose not to be angered. Instead, he listened to the soldier's recollection of events that day. He chose to try and understand that perspective. They walked away from the conversation, having not resolved the way the man had thought it would, but they continued the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, the first conversation is not always the last conversation. And the two of them continued to have conversations over many years. They actually became friends, believe it or not. They still meet up to this day. And the soldier did share later on that he wished his bullet hadn't found the little boy and blinded him. But the outcome of the first conversation was not what the man had expected. So in your planning for your conversation, think about how you'll respond if if the person says no to your request, or if they choose to become aggressive and argumentative. How are you going to avoid the conversation spiraling out of control? Okay, I'm just conscious of the time. Okay, so we're getting to the end of today's session. Before I start the summary, if there are any questions or feedback that you want to do, drop them in the comments now, because I'm going to be finished in about 5 minutes. So we've covered a lot, short space of time, and I'm going to take a little drink of water first. Feel my throat going dry. So let me step through the 6 steps once again. And hopefully you've got a lot of this written down. Step 1, determine why and when you want to have the conversation. You need to be able to articulate that. Step 2, choose a very specific example that you're going to anchor the conversation to. A single time and place, specific facts, don't generalize. Step 3, state how it made you feel without getting emotional. So stay calm. Express the feelings that you had, but in a very calm way, as I demonstrated earlier on. Step 4, keep quiet, listen with the intention of understanding. Step 5, validate what you hear, reflect back on what they've said. It's easy for you to get upset if you feel that you just shared with them and then they just, in their moment of sharing their thoughts, have not even acknowledged you and what you said. Don't rise to it. You're the better communicator. You validate what you heard from them. Then step 6, state your why. Again, stay calm, state your why, and state any request that you have for a change in behavior or a change in boundary or what it is that you would like to be the outcome. And that's where you finish the conversation. If you need to then have full-on conversations, you can, but that initial conversation is for them to know what they did how it made you feel, for you to understand their position, and then you choose to reiterate what you would like to happen next. Now, it could be that if you feel what needs to happen next is a follow-on conversation because you haven't got things resolved, then think about how you might want to state that. Okay, now I hope you found that helpful. And if you do want to continue developing your knowledge and growing your confidence and growing your communication skills, please come join us in the course, right? Love to see you there. Now, let me take a quick look and see if anybody else commented. Okay, Rachel, so yes, that helped. Okay, brilliant. Excellent. You're welcome. So I think I'm just looking through the comments. I don't see anything new. If anybody wants to come off mute and actually ask a question, it would be a great time to do that as well. A few people saying thank you. You're very welcome. Thanks for being here. I love having you here. Thanks so much for the engagement. I can't tell you what a big difference it makes when people are chatting away and answering the questions and get involved. So thank you so much for that as well. Okay, that was very helpful. Thank you. You're very welcome. Emma, nice to see you again and great to have you here. Okay, if there are no questions, and I see a few people dropping off now, so I will wrap up, let you get back to the office. That's all for today. Thanks for watching and bye for now.